and 360 pounds for the lower chambers. With these pressures, the clearance between the bottoms of the lower chambers and the ends of the pistons should be 1 5/8 inches. To make certain that there has been no leakage in the transfer valve, the gauge is put on the upper chamber and checked again to see if it reads 90 pounds. We're moving right along now, and we're ready for installation of the tail feathers. The fin and horizontal stabilizer are treated as a subassembly, which is installed by means of 10 bolts here and here, and 4 bolts in the rear bulkhead here and here. When this is done, the crew will be ready to string the control surface cables. There can be no confusion in stringing these cables because before shipping, each cable has been tagged to show where it goes. After the cables have been strung, the pulleys are put in place. The elevator tab cables are connected, and the cover plates are put on. The same procedure is followed for the rudder trim tab cables. Now the trim box in the cockpit should be set in neutral. The elevator control rod is placed in the tail and into position. The forward end is connected inside the fuselage. The elevator can now be installed. On each side, there are 2 stabilizer hinge fittings and 1 trim tab universal connection. The elevator control rod is connected to the elevator. The rudder is connected at the 2 pin hinges here and the rudder trim tab universal here. The rudder cables are connected next. This can be done only after the man in the cockpit has put the control lock to on position in order to place the rudder in neutral. When all the cables, bonding, and rudder tail light have been properly connected and inspected by the crew chief, the assembly of the tail feathers is complete. The ship is now ready for the installation of the propeller. Here are the steps in preparing for propeller installation. The plane is nosed up to within about 2 feet of the platform, so the men will have something to stand on while they work. Your very first action is to remove this brush holder assembly, because the brushes would be snapped off if the propeller were put on with the brush holder in place. Out comes the inner cone, and don't forget the shim, which is right behind it. The cone and shim must be thoroughly cleaned with a suitable solvent, and also the propeller shaft. The splines on the propeller shaft and also the cone and shim are then coated with a light oil. When this is done, the shim first and then the cone are replaced, making sure that the open portion of the cone is at the top. The propeller lock nut threads are coated with the prescribed mixture of castor oil and white lead. While the shaft is being made ready, the protective coating from the propeller itself can be removed. The splines on the inside of the propeller hub are cleaned and oiled, and the slip rings are wiped clean of any oil or dirt. When both the shaft and the propeller are ready for assembly, the propeller is brought up to the plane. You need at least 10 men for this job. Under the guidance of the crew chief, the propeller is carefully placed on the shaft. The number 1 blade should be on top so that the splines will be readily engaged. Now the main propeller shaft nut is tightened with the 4-foot propeller bar. After the nut has been drawn tight, insert the locking sleeve and secure with the lock pin assembly. Next, after cleaning, the brush assembly is put in place and the brushes checked for proper clearance on the slip rings using Prussian blue according to standard procedure. The propeller hub electric contact points are cleaned and made ready to receive the power unit. The power unit itself is removed from the case and cleaned with particular attention to cleaning around the contact points. Since the power unit is set in low pitch when packed, the blades on the propeller must be set in low pitch also. When the power unit is installed, the 8 bolts are drawn up and secured with safety wire. The propeller gear housing is then greased, and the speed-reducing gear housing is oiled. With the power unit cover or spinner installed, the propeller assembly is complete. Now, all of the major connections on the airplane have been made. After a thorough inspection by the crew chief, we install the fillets and secondary cowling. The pilot seat is returned to its place in the cockpit. And when the pitot tube, antenna wires, radio mast, and pilot's rear view mirror have been installed, the armorers are ready to take over, to install the guns and charge them. The job of assembly is done. The plane is towed off to the airfield runway. Here, after the plane has been fueled, the crew chief runs up the engine and makes one final check on the operation of all instruments and movable surfaces.
Ready to fly and ready to fight. This plane has been completely uncrated and assembled in the field. This simplified uncrating and assembly method is the answer to field requirements. Just as the plane itself, the P-47, answers the requirements of the fighting pilot. The Thunderbolt is in the air.